Professor Iliffe, thank you so much for joining us. Wanted to ask you about Robert Hooke. Can you tell us something about Robert Hooke?
Yes, Robert Hooke was born in the Isle of Wight in 1635. He was a talented young man, son of a vicar who went to Oxford in the early 1650s and was introduced to a number of major scientists and others at the time, Christopher Wren, John Wilkins, who was the head of Wadham College. And Wilkins got round him a group of young men who were curious, full of ingenuity, and they became fascinated by what was called natural philosophy or science, but also fascinated by mechanics, building objects. Robert Hooke's particular interest was in building flying machines, or in the idea of flying, and I think that feeds into his work on springs, which ultimately, I suppose, gives rise to Hooke's law. In the late 1650s, Hooke worked with others and built the first air pump. So a pump or a vacuum, a receiver that can produce a vacuum in which you can do experiments on respiration and combustion. And then in 1660, after the Civil Wars, there was a restoration of the King, Charles II, and the Royal Society was founded in the same year. And Hooke moved from Oxford and became very involved in the workings of the Royal Society. And for a couple of decades, he was the chief person in the Royal Society doing extraordinary experiments, extraordinary observations of the heavens. In the 1680s, he came up against Isaac Newton. Newton was writing his great work, the Principia Mathematica, and Hooke did provide some inspiration for some of the ideas that Newton had. He asked Newton for some credit for some of these ideas, and Newton refused to give him any credit. And then I think afterwards, for the last sort of 15 years of Hooke's life, and he died in 1703, he did brilliant things, but I think was despondent that he hadn't quite got the credit he felt he deserved. And strangely, I think it's only really in the early 21st century that Hooke's reputation has been revived to the level that it should be. But we can talk about some of the things he did during his extraordinarily productive years in London.
Thank you. And so was it this sort of personalities that meant he's not so well known, Robert Hooke?
Well, Hooke was ambitious. He was exceptionally productive. He worked exceptionally hard. He was a miser. When he died, he had £12,000 in cash under his bed. It's very hard to turn that into modern money, but it's something like £500,000 just in cash. He didn't like spending it. We have a diary from the 1670s of his life in London, and it's an extraordinary document. It just shows how busy he was, moving from various warehouses to coffee houses to the Royal Society and so on. And he was somebody who did give information to others, but he loved to get information in a number of different arenas. But he's best known, I think, for his work on the air pump in the late 1650s, and he became the major experimenter in the Royal Society using the air pump. He developed some pioneering work in optics. It was crucial for Isaac Newton's work on optics, but also what Hooke did was of immense significance in its own right. And that fed his work on lenses and his theorizing about the unseen world, fed into his great work, Micrographia, of 1665, which is the work that's got the wonderful images of fleas and the compound eye of a housefly or drone, and the first images of a cell. It's Hooke who coined the term cell, really because of an analogy, not only with a honeycomb, but also with what he thought were what monks lived in their monasteries. So his work has been very, very influential in that regard. Later on, he did excellent work on comets and in astronomy, but he was an ingenious man who was also somebody who invented a lot of scientific instruments, and he developed his own instrumentation And he was known really up until Newton became the key player in English science. Robert Hooke was the person known across Europe as, if you like, England's Leonardo.
And the discovery of cells, was it recognized at the time as being an incredible discovery, or has it only been with time that we've looked back and realized it was a big discovery?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, what Hooke does in micrographia is he really pioneers the use of the microscope as a scientific instrument. There are lots of wonderful images, stuff that today is still recognizable, including images of the cell in pieces of cork. But he's one of a number of people at the time who were major microscopists. I mean, I think of Jan Swammerdam in Europe, also Marcello Malpighi, who was sponsored by the Royal Society and did wonderful work on embryology and in the structure of tissue cells. And then the greatest of them all, I think, is Antony van Leeuwenhoek of the Netherlands. And he and Hooke, sort of, if you like, they pushed each other, they inspired each other to make major developments in microscopy. For various reasons, I think Leeuwenhoek was able to look at things at a much deeper level. But Hooke, I think, was the best of all of these, the most able of all of these to theorize about what he was seeing. I mean, you have to remember that until very recently, until just before Hooke and others were making these observations, it was pretty much assumed that microscopes merely magnified things that you could see with the naked eye. So I think that's very important. It's only with Hooke and others that people start thinking that with a microscope, you can see things that you can't see with the naked eye. I think that's very important to understand that. Once you realize that you're going beyond what the naked eye can see, then you're in a completely different world. And it really it does damage to the collective mentality, I think, of European science, that there are these unseen worlds that have an infinite number of unimaginable things in them. You know, previously human beings, I think, had thought that they were coming close to discovering everything, and suddenly this one instrument, much more so than the telescope, tells you that all around you there are these things that were unimaginable. No one knew that this stuff was around us, and now here it is.
So the microscope really did open up a completely different world for people. It was a revolution of sorts.
It was a revolution, and I think people talk about it being a new world. It's like the discovery of the Americas, or the discovery of parts of Africa that no one had seen, or the discovery of parts of Asia that no Europeans had seen. And people talk about it as being a new world. They talk, or new worlds, and they talk about the microscope as a much more so than the telescope, but the microscope is an extension of the eye. It is very interesting, I think, that with the advent of these new instruments using glass, so they're lens based, the sort of human being, him or herself, is downgraded. You know, I think previously people had thought that human beings were good enough to see the world as it really was. But with each new development of the telescope and microscope, you can see just how frail and inadequate human sensory perception is by itself without these additions. And I think it's a fascinating thing to bear in mind. And people at the time are also fascinated by that thought. They're worried by it.
Thank you so much for opening up how exciting the microscope is, and for sharing with us those exciting times. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.